Good morning. I'm joined here with the Chief Health Officer, Dr. Andy Robertson, to update you on the concerning and evolving COVID situation on the east coast of Australia. On Wednesday, Western Australia changed its border arrangements with Victoria, transitioning that state to a low-risk jurisdiction. We've been keeping a very close eye on developments in Victoria, which you would know has gone into lockdown to combat the latest outbreak. The situation in Victoria has unfortunately worsened overnight. On the advice provided by Dr. Robertson this morning, we briefed the Premier and the emergency management team, and I have signed new directions to move our border arrangements with Victoria from low risk to medium risk. The tougher medium risk restrictions will begin at midnight tonight. That means from midnight there are stricter controls on the people who can enter WA from Victoria and their reasons for travelling. This also applies to anyone who has been in Victoria at any time in the 14 days before they enter WA. Anyone who has recently arrived from Victoria prior to midnight tonight must continue to comply with their existing directions under the low-risk settings provided to them when they entered WA in recent days. So Victoria now joins New South Wales and Queensland as medium risk states. That means approved travellers arriving into WA from Victoria from midnight, and to be precise, 12:01 AM Saturday, July 17, all those people arriving will need to self-quarantine in a suitable premise for 14 days. They will also need to present for an initial COVID-19 test within the first 48 hours. They will need to present for a further COVID-19 test if any symptoms develop during their time in quarantine, and they must also present for a COVID test on day 11 of their 14-day period. We know there'll be Western Australians in Victoria hurriedly rearranging their travel plans to get home as quickly as possible. We'll be taking that into consideration as those residents return over the next few days. But I want to take this opportunity to urge all Western Australians who want to get home to return without delay. We've seen what's happened in other places, such as in New South Wales, and how quickly this COVID virus can spread in the community. Western Australians who are in Victoria who want to come home, but for whatever reason might delay making plans to return, need to understand it may be even more difficult for you to get approval to come into Western Australia. I understand that there are individual and family circumstances which impact on people and their reasons for travel. The Department of Health and Police will continue to work with those people as compassionately and reasonably as possible. But the overwhelming concern, which underscores all of this decision making, is the health of the Western Australian community. On a positive note for our community, I can report that on all the cases associated with the Mindari cluster have now all cleared their health checks, and there are no new cases in Western Australia today, either in our community or those who have arrived from overseas. I thank the people of WA who continue to do the right thing, but we all must be vigilant. Invite questions, and then Dr. Robertson will also speak.
Just making sure, so you're saying that they have to have an exemption to come in after 12:01?
That's correct.
And everyone who arrives before that is under the low risk.
That's right.
Which is self-quarantine.
That's right. So both cohorts, those people arriving today up till midnight, will all have to self-quarantine for 14 days, as will anyone arriving after midnight. But in all cases, they will have to complete 14 days and undergo COVID testing. The criteria, though, for those arriving after midnight is much stricter. So we expect much lower numbers.
Is there a risk in that? I mean, I don't know how many flights there are between now and midnight. Do you know?
There's about 6.
How many many people would be potentially coming in?
We have, look, I don't have, Gary, the exact number. We can source that for you, but what we've found is that people are making judgment decisions themselves, realising that they will have to go into 14-day quarantine. But we also appreciate that this is a decision made this morning. There will be valid and genuine reasons that people will have to return home. So it gives people an opportunity to return, but accepting that they will have to undertake their 14 days quarantine and testing. What it does mean though, and what I'm reinforcing, is that if they are WA residents, and I don't want to trivialise this, but if they're having a holiday or they have some other not essential reason to remain in Victoria, they must appreciate that the strict criteria may mean they won't be able to return on their election.
What's the story for people who can't make it onto one of those 6 flights?
Well, they can apply through the GTG process. We will assess each case on a case-by-case basis.
Can I ask you a footy question? St Kilda are due to play.
I'm unsurprised. Go on.
St Kilda are due to play next week here. Do they need? Is there some suggestion that they may be coming in on Sunday and going into a sort of a bubble arrangement? Have you heard anything about that?
We're discussing with the AFL today and Optus Stadium, so those discussions continue, and we look forward to continuing to work with the AFL. Once they submit their firm plans to us, the Chief Health Officer and I will make an assessment on if it's in the public health interests to conduct the game. So once the AFL have consolidated that, but it's a bit of a moving feast. But look, I'll take the opportunity to endorse what the AFL are doing. Like many other industry sectors, it's in everyone's interest that their particular industry maintains a safe working place. So we've seen that throughout this period of the pandemic. The resource sector, amongst others, and indeed the AFL, they've been very diligent in their planning, their protocols, their testing regime, and certainly Andy and I have had long discussions with them, and we're satisfied that they run a pretty well organised approach, but they'll have to comply with the conditions that Western Australia put down. It won't be on their terms.
Do you appreciate though that for the general public who can't come back or struggle to come back, that it looks like double standards?
Well, everyone's got an opportunity to apply, and we have had thousands of people who have made application to come, and they haven't all been valid. So these people do that for a professional living. There's obviously a big social contract with the community, because we're all living through tough times, and I'm not suggesting that sport is the only reason that people can actually enjoy and recreate. But look, they've been operating very professionally, and so we're again are not trying to discriminate against individuals or different sectors. We've got to balance up what's in the public interest.
Is work considered valid to come past midnight?
Depending on the nature of it and whether it's absolutely a necessity for a worker to come. So while I've already said the resource sector have operated quite well, if they can source, e.g. truck drivers, from places other than those that have got COVID running pretty hard in those communities, then obviously we've been endorsing and supporting local employment as much as possible. The less the people move, the less the virus will move. That's really the premise on which we're coming from.
Was this decision based on just the numbers this morning out of Victoria, or further information that you and the Chief Health Officer received about where they think it might be going?
Oh, look, Dr Robertson will expand on the public health side, but on the assessments that we make, it's predicated very much on the public health reasoning, which I'm sure Andy will expand on, but it also is whether it's practical to actually and able to be reasonably enforced. So we've got people that travel across the state by road, by sea, by air. We've got to balance up whether we can practically enforce it to make sure our border control is strict. Our border control measures have worked very, very well, so we're not really changing that at all. What we're doing is what we've done previously. If the situation worsens in a particular state or territory, then we'll apply a very strict approach in order to keep the virus out of the state.
Do you know, is there any triage for G2G requests? Say, for example, children that have gone over east or gone to Victoria for school holidays. if they're children, do they get fast-tracked, or is there any special treatment for those?
Look, we as I mentioned, apply a case-by-case analysis on any such request. We don't intentionally try and keep families apart. People have a whole myriad of reasons and circumstances, but certainly this is not designed to keep children away from their carers or parents. So at all times we try and keep the family unit together, and we understand that there are at times very complicated arrangements, but we work individually with each of those cases.
Commissioner, there were some large fines handed down yesterday for COVID breaches.
Yes, there were, and look, that's important for the community to understand that when you actually are given a direction, you are required to comply with that. You run the risk of imprisonment. Some people have been imprisoned and some people have been heavily fined. So I can say that a 58-year-old man, originally from New South Wales, was charged with 5 counts of failing to comply with a direction. We allege that he arrived in WA via road, via Eucla. He was issued with a self-quarantine direction and on 5 occasions breached. He was subsequently arrested and has been fined $10,000. That's a salutary reminder that these directions are not put in there just because we're making arbitrary decisions. If you're given a direction, you must comply with it. This man's now been fined $10,000. There are others that have been fined $4,000, others with suspended prison sentences. Some in the last week have been issued with an actual prison sentence. So we have to be serious about it. And we know and we've seen where people blatantly breach and they're actually getting criminal convictions. So we cannot trivialise this and say, well, look, they're just going out to get food or whatever they might be doing. They've got to comply.
The Greenacre man, what was he doing when he left home 5 times?
I don't have those particulars, Peter. But
okay. Roughly how many, given we're now hard border with the entire eastern seaboard, how many arrivals from New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland are currently in isolation in WA, and how much of Australians is putting on police resources?
We've got just over 5,000 people presently. On my briefing this morning, about 5,200 are presently in home quarantine. We have also around about 1,200 people Department of Health are managing through our hotel quarantine, but they are dominated almost exclusively by international arrivals. So for Australians that are returning to WA, just over 5,000. And they are broadly complying. The issue about resourcing, look, we actively encourage people to use the G2G Now virtual app. I used it myself when I had to do quarantine. It works very well, and then you don't have to deploy police to go and knock on doors and physically check. But we will and do check physically to make sure people are home. That's how, in fact, we've been uncovering those few people that aren't complying with directions. They run the risk of being arrested.
And how does compliance compare with, say, a year ago when we're in what feels like the same situation? Are people getting more lax in trying their luck?
Look, I don't think so, Peter. I think we've seen a really good cooperative approach by people in WA. They understand that the enforcement approach we've adopted has been policing by consent. We do that as compassionately as we can, but if they're belligerent and they're blatant and they're putting others at risk, then we will and do charge them. But broadly speaking, I've not seen a trend where people are increasingly breaking the rules. I think people understand it. I watch the news like most people do, and you see the tragic situation happening just to the north of us in Indonesia and in other parts of the world, and you see the severity of this disease, and Andy and I and others discuss this every day. I think the broader community actually understand that we live in a very privileged part of the world, and Western Australians are very privileged. I think we've got very good understanding and cooperation.
Commissioner, can police provide figures on how many G2G applications are being denied from people in New South Wales right now?
Look, I can't at the moment. I'll attempt to get some figures. It's a fluid basis though, because the situation is some people apply for G2G applications months out. They've got some event that they're planning to go to. It might be a wedding or whatever it might be. And so they're not actually time measured to a particular day. So it's actually quite difficult to give you a an approximate number that are relevant for each particular day. We've got basically a large bucket of GTG applications.
Is it safe to say there's a lot more being denied than accepted right now?
Oh, that absolutely, yes.
And is it the case that people from Victoria will have their G2G cancelled from midnight?
Yes, look, it's probably useful that I explain this. Whenever the conditions change, people that have already applied and received a G2G approval, when the conditions change at midnight tonight, people in Victoria who are scheduled to travel, e.g. tomorrow onwards, will find that they've got a message on their smart device. The G2G application will quite clearly say to them, your application is no longer approved, you will need to reapply. I did it myself, it took me about 2 minutes. And then on the reapplication, under the new conditions, they will then get a response as to whether in fact their application is either approved or denied. So it does require about 2 minutes to re-enter your details. Some people find that very frustrating, but what we can't anticipate, we don't have a crystal ball on what the conditions are going to be next Saturday week. It may change yet again. So that's why this approach is done in a virtual way, based on the existing health advice and the conditions we apply.
Commissioner, can I ask you about the Mindari shootout? The senior commentator who's in custody, will police allege he pulled a trigger?
I haven't got a brief that he has been charged with specific criminal offences on the shooting. I am aware that a man was apprehended, that he's a Commentero bikie, but I don't have any particulars with me as to whether he's charged with an actual shooting offence.
Do you know if he's still in custody?
I don't know presently.
Do you have any idea on which other gang may have been involved in the shootout?
No.
But it's part of turf war tension, this incident?
Oh, look, as I've commented previously, I consider all bikie gangs criminal gangs. They are. They're criminal gangs, and look, they'll fight within themselves, they'll fight against each other or against other people when they're dealing in crime. They're generally dealing in drugs, and they'll have fights. And the serious thing about this, it's probably a little too light for me to describe it as a fight. It's criminal behaviour. When you're firing weapons in the community, people get killed, people get seriously injured, and sometimes innocent parties do. So we are putting every effort into enforcing the law as strictly as we can. So I know the night of, I think last night, I think there were about 9 or 10 search warrants executed on bikie premises, and we will continue to be relentless in strongly enforcing the law. That's what the community expect, and that's what the bikies should expect.
Could we ask some questions of Dr. Robertson?
So,
Dr. Robertson, how long do you expect these rules to be in place for Victoria?
So the current rules, as we go into medium, will really depend on what the situation evolves like over the next couple of weeks. So obviously, if they can get it under control, if they can get the community cases back down to zero, and that's obviously the main aim of their 5-day lockdown, is to try and do exactly that, to stop the transmission chains, to stop the spread, get on top of it with the testing and with their contact tracing. And if they're successful, and towards the end of the week, or towards the end of next week probably, they have got to that situation, then obviously we'll continue to review, and we'll make some further decisions. Now, the first step is likely for us to go from medium to low, but it is very dependent on the current situation.
In your expert opinion and how Sydney's tracking, can you see this lasting months up until Christmas?
Look, I think they have locked down. Victoria's locked down very quickly, so we would hope that will be highly effective, and they'll get on top of it very quickly. With Sydney, it may take longer. It almost certainly will take longer because of the size of it. With over 1,000 active cases now, and with still cases occurring in the community. So I would imagine it will take a couple of months at least, but it will really, again, depend on the controls that they manage to get over the outbreak.
What would you say to people who say, well, why shouldn't I be able to go back to WA, isolate, be tested, and live in that regime for 14 days, where a football player can?
So basically, we place the same requirements on football teams, on on people who come back. Now, it doesn't matter.
From 1201 though. From 1201.
So from 1201, there will be exemptions, but we will look at, and obviously if people are caught, we will look at how, the reasons they were there and, why they've been caught in Victoria, and we obviously be compassionate and reasonable about what the approach is to those people, and obviously encourage them to come back early if they can. So that is already in place, and it's working well, I think, in both New South Wales and Queensland at the moment. So, and we've done this on a number of times before, and people understand that, and they make that move and they do the appropriate thing.
So you don't fear any sort of backlash that a footy team might be able to come here on Sunday and isolate and then play footy?
So if the football team comes, they usually come as part of a quarantine bubble. I mean, there is an assumption that they're just roaming in the community. That's not correct. They come in as part of a quarantine arrangement. They go to a suitable accommodation. They are transported in suitable transport. They have to remain. The only time they can leave is for training. They can't go out at night. They are as if they were in normal quarantine. And if they stay after the 7 days, they will remain in quarantine again. So they would, if they stayed here for 14 days, they would spend 14 days in quarantine, just like anybody else who's coming back from those states.
We've heard from a number of West Australians who are returning from overseas for different reasons, and the only way they can get back into the country is through New South Wales or Victoria. When they finish their 2 weeks of quarantine there, are they likely to be granted an exemption to get into Western Australia, or are they going to be stuck on the other side of the country?
No, there are already well-established protocols for those kind of people. As long as they basically leave the quarantine hotel, get on the first flight, and there is a time period that they have to do that within, and come straight in, they won't be required to quarantine. Obviously they need to wear masks, but that's a requirement on airlines as well. So we have a number of those that occur every day, who've done their time there and they come straight across. What has happened, however, is some of them think, it's a good time to have a couple of days holiday. That if they do that, then all bets are off and they have to go back to the normal quarantine. But if they do the right thing, go straight from the quarantine hotel to the airport and return to WA, then they won't be required to do further quarantine.
And Dr. Robertson, the Mindari cluster cases, they've all got the all clear now.
That's
Have
correct.
we learned anything new about those transmissions or their infections? How ill did these people get? Anything like that?
So we obviously were able to lock down that cluster early. Well, I think what we did show is that it can be easily spread in relatively casual contacts. We've seen the two who were at the brewery. They had limited contact. We still don't know exactly what contact they had, but certainly from our review of CCTV and other methods, they didn't know each other. They were at some distance from each other. So we are fairly confident that was limited contact. So it does show that it can. We've also seen it does spread in families, and we saw that obviously that basically, with the exception of one who had been vaccinated, all of the partners became infected.
Are you disappointed at our vaccine take-up at the moment? You've seen statistics that those over 60 are dragging their feet.
Well, I think I did see the front page today. It's probably a little misleading. They're not actually dragging their feet. So what is happening is that the percentage of those from 40 to 49-year-old who are totally vaccinated is higher. But what people have seemed to have forgotten is that the 60 to 69-year-olds are getting AstraZeneca. So it's rather than a 3 week to get them fully vaccinated, they have a 12 week. So they've almost double the number of vaccines, first doses, in that 60 to 69-year-old group compared to the 40 to 49-year-old. So if you look at first doses, they're double. If you look at second doses, where there is that longer delay, then they're about the same. So yes, we are strongly encouraging that group to get vaccinated, but we certainly and we will continue to do that, but I don't think there's a major issue there as sort of portrayed.
Would you support a vaccine lottery to encourage people to get out there? There's discussion around an incentive.
Look, I think there are a lot of discussions that are occurring around incentives across a range of areas. I think the most important thing at the moment is for us to continue getting it out and encouraging people to go and get the vaccine. There is vaccine out there. If people, we're obviously offering it, encouraging people to get the vaccine through our clinics, but there's also the general practices. Pharmacists have now started giving it in some of our country areas. The GP respiratory clinics all have availability for vaccine. If people go onto the websites, they can find availability. It doesn't matter what age you are, whether you're 40 or 70, there is vaccine out there and available.
Dr. Robertson, what do you say to those over 60 who say, well, I'll have a jab, but I'm only going to have Pfizer? Do you see the rules changing? Will there be enough supply so that they can do that eventually?
So we are anticipating, increased supply over the second, half of the year. However, I will make the point that, what we're seeing in New South Wales is there is 75 people currently in hospital. There's, I think, around 18 in intensive care, and a number of those are under 30. And we have 5 on ventilators. It is too late to get your vaccine in the middle of an outbreak. And people really should be seriously considering that, yes, we have been very lucky here, but they need to think about what happens if we got an outbreak in Perth, what happens if people we got a major outbreak in Perth, what happens if people start getting sick. You need at least 3 to 4 weeks with the AstraZeneca vaccine, similar period of time with the Pfizer vaccine until you get protection. Obviously, it's important that you do that. So we would strongly encourage people, vaccines available, they should be getting out there and getting it.
We've seen some cases in New South Wales and Victoria where some people have been vaccinated and didn't get the virus and some that did. Can you explain why some people who are vaccinated are picking it up, and are they not as sick as others? Or?
So it's a very good point. So the vaccines, both the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca vaccine do 2 things. One, they'll stop you getting it, and we've seen that. The party in Sydney where 30 people were at the party, 5 who were vaccinated didn't get the disease, 25 who were unvaccinated did. So we know that it does stop it, and it will also stop you spreading it on. And so the 2 vaccines probably reduce your chance of getting it and spreading it by about 90%. But that means there's still a small percentage, 10%, who will get it and who can spread it. So, and that's part of the reason when people say, oh, I'm vaccinated, therefore I shouldn't have to go into quarantine. The problem is people still can get it and still spread it. What we have seen though with the vaccines is that people are almost invariably not getting serious illness. So the initial 5 people in New South Wales, I don't know if you remember, very early on there was the nursing home. There was 5 people in their 80s and 90s. They were taken to a hospital, but largely none of them became seriously ill. Now that's a population which has a very high chance of getting serious disease and unfortunately a high chance of dying. So what we're seeing is very good protection against serious disease, very good protection against premature death. So it is worth having that vaccine.
It sounds like being vaccinated won't stop people skipping quarantine or skipping an exemption order. That won't ever happen in WA where someone says, I'm vaccinated, I should be able to come in without the hard border.
Not at this stage, but we will consider it as we go through a different stage. Once we get all of the population that's vulnerable vaccinated, and I should make the point that we're doing quite well in that area. The over 75, the over 70s are now 76% vaccinated. So we are getting that vulnerable population vaccinated, but there are other vulnerable populations that we need to work through. Once we have that protection, there may come a time where we will be allowed to do that because the risk is low enough that the odd case that occurs we can manage very easily.
That's one, sorry, just to clarify, that's one jab, is it? Or when you say over 76%, is that?
I've had at least one jab, yeah.
Has the AFL approached you to host a possible hub here, similar to what they did in Queensland last year?
So we've had certainly discussions with around upcoming matches, and we would anticipate that they will look at their current arrangements. Obviously, they're changing with the lockdown in Victoria, with the lockdown, the tightening up of the Queensland border towards Victoria. They'll be obviously looking at their options at the moment, and obviously if they do, then it's something we will consider in due course.
And how does that sit to have a number of clubs hubbing here?
Again, they would be required to abide by our quarantine requirements. So that means that they would have to come in, they would have to do some form of, they'd have to do quarantine for 14 days. But like any other individual, once they've done the 14 days and they've gone through that period of time, then they will be free to train and play games.
So you haven't specifically been asked that question though at this stage by the AFL?
I haven't been approached about it. We've been approached about single matches, coming up, but not about a hub at the moment.
Is it something you're thinking about though, considering that the situation is possibly getting worse?
That's really a decision for the AFL to make. They have to obviously look at how they want to run their competition over the next couple of months, but obviously it's something we would consider if asked.
I just wanted to ask that one, going back to my previous question about, you mentioned that if we got the vulnerable population vaccinated, then people who are vaccinated may penetrate the hard border and others not. What is the vulnerable population above 60?
So the vulnerable population consists of a number of different groups. So there are obviously those over 60, but there's also those that are under 60 who may have chronic illness, may have a disease that makes them far more susceptible. And then there are obviously other more vulnerable groups within our population, in the disability services area, obviously some of our in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So we need to be looking at all of those groups and to make sure that they've had ability to be vaccinated, and preferably to make sure that they have good vaccination rates.
Sorry, Dr. Robertson, your written advice to the Premier when you're recommending border closures often makes reference to modelling of the Alpha and Delta variants and the impact spread would have in WA. Who's doing that modelling? What does it show? And will you release it? Because you're using it for justification, but it's never been publicly released.
So the modelling, some of that modelling has been released, and I think the latest one was released in May, which is it was dated back to March 2021. So that some of it is released. It is largely done by the Doherty, the Peter Doherty Institute in Melbourne on behalf of the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee, and that modelling is then provided to the AHPPC and then eventually to the National Cabinet, and then it's up to their National Cabinet as to whether they would like that modelling to be released. And
so the Delta variant modelling that we've been talking about in recent weeks, has that been completed? Has it gone to national?
The Delta variant modelling is still under development.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, and then it's...
Ideally, we have like a good closer in here.
Yeah.
Get the door up there and go...
Yeah.
7 meters.
Yeah.
You get how it works. Like the fridge is alive.
Is it? Yeah.
So you can check it in.
That's good. I didn't know what to do with the